Well, here we are, folks. Just a picture and an audio track. I'm completely out of the ability to do any kind of coherent editing. For those of you who don't know, I am currently going through the process of candidacy examination, where at the end of it, if I pass, I will officially be a doctoral candidate, and then hopefully it'll be another year or two, I will have my PhD in geology. So I hope to be back to more edited content soon, once this process is over in the next couple of weeks. I wanted to talk to you today about the newest version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I recently saw. I'm a pretty big horror fan. I think this one is probably the best in the franchise since the 2003 remake, which by early 2000s horror remake standards is practically Citizen Kane. Certainly better than the movie that implied that Alexandra Daddario was in her 40s. The movie is very competently shot, and the cinematography is great in places, and the sound design is phenomenal. The only real complaint I have about it is basically a generic slasher, and there's nothing that necessitates that this was a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. You could slot almost any generic slasher villain into this. Though I will say that it does make sense for the character of Leatherface. It seems like in the original he's contextualized as a person who doesn't really like murder. He just does it because it's what his family wants and because the kids in the first movie invaded his home. So it makes sense that he would, not kill anybody for 50 years and then go on a rampage once his home was invaded once again. But even with that, it still just doesn't feel like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie to me. And I don't particularly care at all that they got the final girl character to basically be useless in this movie. I mean, I'm not overly invested to that, and it's a different actress anyway because the original actress died, but it just seemed like a complete waste of time. So one thing I really do want to talk about, though, is how the film portrays gentrification. So gentrification is generally when a historically undercapitalized area receives an influx of capital and prices out the residents who used to live there. Now, it mostly gets talked about in the context of urban black communities who have been historically undercapitalized thanks to practices like redlining. But it also happens in rural communities, and some of those communities are even black. It's been a problem in the Sea Islands with the Gullah Geechee people for quite a while. I live in a place that has been slowly gentrifying over the past few years. In the Poconos, we've got a lot of increase in people moving in and amenities going up, though fortunately it's not to the point where I wouldn't be able to afford to buy a home in the neighborhood I grew up. Here in Bethlehem, where I'm currently stationed, gentrification is quite extreme. Where when I was a kid, Bethlehem had a reputation of like shoot your way in, shoot your way back out. But now, thanks I think in particular to Lehigh University and an emerging tech industry, it's really starting to gentrify and become a much more respectable community. It was basically the Pittsburgh of the East. And Pittsburgh has undergone the same process thanks to Carnegie Mellon. What's really interesting is that the gentrifier in this movie is a black character. But all of that cleverness just gets thrown out the window by none of the characters being remotely subtle. That the final girl was traumatized by gun violence isn't really allowed to develop. Like, they try, but I think I would have appreciated it far more if she'd been allowed to have that relationship with that native Texan who was comfortable with guns, and they'd actually gone out and shot the guns, and had they actually allowed the main character and the Texan guy to have sex rather than just implying that they wanted to, it might have been stronger. His death then could have been a big emotional moment and allowed her to overcome her fears, but as written, it's just underwhelming. Like, all of the character arcs are underwhelming and most of the characters aren't likable. But the reason I'm talking about this movie is that rural gentrification as an issue almost never comes up. And I think that's because gentrification helps a certain sort of neoliberal-oriented politician get elected. It's one of those, we can fight racism without actually having to take any action, because in our society, thanks to ideas like critical race theory and intersectionalism, racism has been so thoroughly divorced from classism that you can just easily claim to be doing good while keeping established economic entrenchments in place. So rural gentrification rarely trades on the race narrative, but it does trade on the class narrative. So where urban gentrification can be completely rooted in a race narrative, and that works for neoliberal politicians, actually caring about the plight of all poor people who are being priced out of their homes by gentrification would require a more subtle and, I think, unpopular for that base critique of capitalism. And I just wasn't expecting that from a slasher movie based on a 50-year-old indie horror flick. But do check the movie out. I'll probably watch it 1 or 2 more times. Wish me luck on this exam, and have a nice day, folks. Bye-bye.